John Han here, and the Pulsing Cinema movie of the day is Day of the Dead, the third film in George Romero's original zombie trilogy from the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and for a long time there, the last official George Romero zombie movie that we had. There have been a lot of rip-offs, and of course there have been that Night of the Living Dead remake and what have you. But I mean, from 1985 on, until the early 2000s, that was it. If you were living in the mid to late 80s, well, I mean, you had a lot to dine on. Oh my God, you had Day of the Dead, you had Return of the Living Dead, and the sequel, which kind of sucked, but had a good poster. And then Dawn of the Dead was still on the air, and Night of the Living Dead was still being shown. Those were a few strong films. Day of the Dead, of course, the third film, the first, and each of these films, these three films, were kind of looked. They kind of represented their respected time period in film and their era. You had the social consciousness and the black and white grit of the 68 Night of the Living Dead, and then the late 70s Dawn of the Dead. You had the comic book consumerism, this big, bright, bold look of that film. And then Day of the Dead was square in the middle of the 80s, and it was a 1980s film. It was underground, and it was punk rock in some way, and transgressive, and I think it freaked out, and it put off a lot of the people that were wanting Dawn of the Dead Part 2, that were wanting another big comic book odyssey. Because The Day of the Dead is a far more low-key film. It's a far more serious film. In some ways, it's far more grim. Though there's some grim elements of Dawn of the Dead, there's also some jubilee and some satire there. A lot more satire than Day of the Dead, which is more of a chamber piece. It's more of this very interior look into these characters, and there's some good drama. I think some really good characters. I remember as a kid watching Day of the Dead. I think I learned about Day of the Dead and started watching it in tandem with the Tom Savini Scream Greats documentary. And then the next thing was like, okay, I gotta see Day of the Dead. And I watched it and rented it on VHS and was like, okay, that's good. It didn't really have much of an effect on me. Subsequently, throughout the years, watching the DVD releases and then watching the new Blu-ray releases, it's come to be one of my favorite films, and it almost competes with Dawn of the Dead as far as being my favorite Living Dead film, because I in my head I often think, okay, Dawn of the Dead is really good. It's one of my favorite films. It's up there with Texas Chainsaw Massacre and 2001: A Space Odyssey and what have you. But then I watch Day of the Dead and I'm like, whoa, this is really good. Every time it kind of grows in stature. Every time I watch it, it just kind of builds, So, all three of these films, again, they're out of continuity, they're different characters, different settings, but they have the continuity of George Romero and his vision for these films. No one else could have made these films other than George Romero, and these films, all three of these films, Night, Dawn, and Day, heavily influential. Everybody has cribbed these things for years. And, when you're doing a zombie film, it's almost like you're doing a George Romero film. It gets very uncomfortable. It gets into that kind of Brian De Palma, Hitchcockian type of lifting sometimes, I feel. Where you're just taking this one guy's intellectual property, and doing what you will with it. It gets to that point. The characters that he's designed and built, and even the archetypes. So Day of the Dead was financed by that deal they'd had with Salah Hassanein, and that throughout the early 80s, George Romero and Richard Rubenstein and Laurel Films, they'd been doing some good stuff, Creep Show, Night Riders, which was not a successful film, but it was still an interesting movie, that got out and got seen. Tales from the Dark Side, the television series. So the time was right to go back to Day of the Dead. There was a lot more to be said, and a lot of cool more stuff to get on the screen. The original screenplay for Day of the Dead is legendary, and it's been published online. It's on the DVD. It was a much larger film. Romero had envisioned this epic. The film kind of started, the original screenplay, which I bought when I was very young and read it. It was, wow, I was excited by it. It basically begins very similar to the Day of the Dead as we know it in a town, but it starts with this group of freedom fighters, and Sarah, and there's some other people in the opening, and it's kind of very much like the helicopter crew, Miguel and the Sarah. There's similar characters, but they're like freedom fighters. And they go into this town that is just besieged with zombies, very much like the finished product. There's a fight on a boat dock. There's a boat dock fight where there's these warring clan, the freedom fighters, and the other people that are fighting them. And then in the middle of them, we've got the zombies. So it's a very exciting sequence. Then they take a boat and they find themselves on this deserted, supposedly remote deserted island, which is actually not remote and deserted. It's actually a government facility where the bigwigs have all gone, and very much like Fiddler's Green in Land of the Dead. And they have installed this facility where they kind of live this kind of debauched bacchanal existence. There is this leader. And they have started to train zombies. They're able to train zombies to do things, and also and basically become a kind of a military force. These zombies. So and then there is a Dr. Logan, and there is other these characters, and so the film eventually ends, of course, like Land of the Dead. Of course, you got this remote island, you got these debauched guys, the villains, and you've got these zombies all around them. Well, what eventually happens? The zombies eventually overrun the facility, and there's a lot of death and dying, and then there's this heavy thing where people want to die without being without coming back to life. Because that was a thing in Dawn of the Dead, but it was a big part of some elements of Day of the Dead, of just being able to die a natural death. And at the end, there's something related to that. So that was way too big. The financiers basically said we could do that film, but we'd have to cut the budget. Or no, he would do that. He had to do that film, but he had to give away Final Cut, and. Apparently George Romero didn't want to do that and retained Final Cut on the film and scaled the screenplay way down into what we see, what the film that was eventually made, which is a good film. I mean, shooting in those caverns, those salt mines, incredible production value, a big look to it. But it's just all natural stuff there, I mean, the salt mines and everything, really amazing. I think everybody was working at a good level. I think, as I said before, some really good performances by Laurie Cardeal and Pilato and everybody, and John Amplas, even his little part there, and the Dr. Logan character. It's all there's just some nice little drama that when you watch it again, you get into these characters and where they're going. And just the fatigue of Laurie Cardeal trying to deal with this, because one of the central ideas behind all of the Dead films is like our ability or inability as a society to get along. It's all about people trying to get along and trying to cooperate. And there's some big ideas and stuff, but they're told within this kind of horror action context, And so all of that is there. All of the social commentary, all of the commentary on men and women and race relations and all of those, that bubbling cauldron of satire and commentary and class warfare, and it's all within all that stuff that makes George Romero's films so goddamn interesting. It's all here in Day of the Dead, and it's all in ample helpings. And I think, Tom Savini's makeup effects in this film, a standout. I mean, really, it hit the high water mark, as far as, I don't think Tom Savini after this really did a film this big. After this, he's doing small projects and Tales from the Dark Side and Monkey Shines and Two Evil Eyes, and so some good character work. But I think in this film, as far as the gore effects, I mean, subsequently to this, you think about gore effects and, the French stuff, Switchblade Romance and Martyrs and Hostel and all of the gore porn stuff and the, torture porn and stuff of the 90s and the 2000s. And I mean, there have been stuff that has been gorier, but I don't think it's been as interesting as when Savini was doing his stuff in the 80s and doing like Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, and the other stuff that he was doing. And this film, Dawn of the Dead, the zombie makeup is good. It's impressive for the amount of zombies that are out there. I mean, you really feel when that elevator comes down and and that pile of zombies, it looks like hundreds and hundreds of zombies. You really get a feel for it. I don't think I've ever seen a film where you got a feel for this just horde of zombies. Most zombie films are all spread out but in this film you really feel that there is just this horde of, and when Miguel, sacrifices himself at the end, you just feel, oh my God. I mean, I saw that on television. That was the first time I saw Day of the Dead was on the USA Network, and it was like, my God, this is really heavy stuff. This is really, really wild, heavy stuff that you just felt it. And then, but I mean, the later zombie films, even like the Night of the Living Dead remake, everything seems spread out, and there may be more hero zombies. They may have somewhat what you'd call better makeup, but I think really, and then the gore effects, the chopped arms, and I think it was Miguel who had his head, pried off. I mean, and his scream, that horrible scream that he, I mean, it's just like, whoa, that was some, And when you go into the caves and you get that blue light and the zombie who gets his head bonked in, it gets a bit stylized, But it's still, really like, it just threw me aback. It's really a high mark in Savini's effects career as far as that. As far as the zombie stuff goes, it was obvious that everybody had kind of had their homework. They had managed to get through Dawn of the Dead, and this is almost kind of like a scaled down version of Dawn of the Dead. I don't know. They're just, to me, Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, they're just, the more I watch Day of the Dead just competing, I kind of like Day of the Dead as much as Dawn, really. Great, as I said, great performances, great direction. Michael Gornick, the camera work, John Harrison, the music, who had kind of come into his own and did the soundtrack for Creepshow. He does this very kind of Caribbean synthesizers track with calypso and stuff. And from what I remember, excuse me, there's not a lot of like stingers. There's not a lot of shocks. I mean, obviously the dream sequence at the beginning, there's a stinger there, and there's some stingers throughout the film, but it's more of, it's just, again, it sets a mood and it sets a tone, and it's just a great soundtrack. And I remember it came out on vinyl, and I bought it at the end of the 90s. I got a used copy, and I used to always love the vocal tracks, which I think there is a vocal track at the end of the film, or part of a vocal track, World Inside Your Eyes, and then If Tomorrow Comes, which is sung by this kind of Michael McDonald-esque vocalist. If tomorrow comes, I love that. So I even love the stuff that probably everybody hated, vocal tracks. I love that. Wow. I think I'm gonna just stop. Again, it's just like Return of the Living Dead. These movies, you know, they're just so big and influential. I could just go on and talk about them forever. Oh man, Day of the Dead, great.